This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, before we get started, because it's really hard for me to even see who's in the room, can we just do some introductions so that I can have some idea who I got over there? Alexa, I know because she's been with me for many trainings. So, and I believe I know Neva, but who else do we have?
Barbara, we have Angela Dawson. She's one of our RCCSs on this shift. We have LaSavion Merity, who is a YCS. We have Shahagini Golden, who is also a YCS. We have Sean Rogers, who is our nurse. Sorry, I unplugged the camera. I was trying to move it closer. And then we have Haley Calhoun, who is our other YCS on this shift. Now I've got to figure out why our camera's not working.
Okay.
We're here, I promise.
I understand this happens at the beginning of every single meeting that we have, and you would think after 2.5 years we would know how to do this, but we don't.
So. You know, it just is. It just is. There we go. There we go. There's everybody.
All right, and Angela, I know Angela. Angela used to come to my trainings in Enterprise.
Yes. So I think probably the new people are this part of the table, right?
Oh, Angela, you may already have gone through this training.
I have.
You have? Okay. You're going to get it again then. Okay, sorry about that. Just before we get started, I have to say a couple of things because I don't know you guys, but I have been involved with the Children's Home since 1998. It was my first job when I moved to from Massachusetts. I was a therapist, and actually they were just building Bruton Hall then. Everything was very different then. But I left and went on to do other things, and I came back. I think it was in 2013. I think I did training there for about 3 years with the child care staff on the Enterprise campus. And I did this certification, I think at least twice. And the way this certification came about was that the lead agency in Orange and Osceola County at the time was Family Services of Metro Orlando. And they were under a corrective action plan because a lot of the kids who were in their foster homes were being subjected to sexual activity. And so the state put them under a corrective action plan. They came to me and asked me to write a training for caregivers of children with sexually reactive behaviors. So that's where this whole thing came from. And then Mindy Chambers was the vice president at FUMSH at the time. She asked me to do it for the child care staff, so I did. So Micah asked me to do this for you. And before we do anything, what I'm going to say is two things. I understand that this might be somewhat uncomfortable for some people, depending on how you've been raised, what culture you're in, how your family handled discussions of sexuality. It's very individual. So we talk about that a little bit. And the second thing is that there are very, very few kids that you're going to get either in Madison or Enterprise or anyplace else that have not had some kind of sexual exposure. And sexual exposure results in often sexual acting out. So we're not talking about kids that are bad. We're not talking about kids that are sex offenders. We're not talking about any of that. We're going to talk about how this evolves in most children in foster care and what you can do about it. So it's a 4-part series. I'm sorry the hurricane upended us last week because we were supposed to start it last week, but I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. And it is ever so much easier for me if you guys are willing to share anything that you have. I have absolutely no problem with that. In fact, I much prefer it. Otherwise, I'm going to be standing up here hawking at you for 3 hours, and you might not find that all that interesting. Okay. This is a 4-part series. It is a training for caregivers of sexually at-risk children and youth, and we're going to do Module A this morning. Micah asked me about this a long time ago, and I know that you have a trauma treatment program on the Enterprise campus, and I'm not all that familiar with how that goes, how that particular training goes. I can tell you because my husband and I started Circle of Friends in 2009. So we do outpatient for children in foster care. And there are very, very few kids that we have that don't have some kind of sexually reactive behavior. And we have a sexual trauma team that we specifically train to work with those children. But almost all kids have some kind of reactive behaviors. It's hard to be in foster care and not have it. If you think about the kids that you have, it's very hard to come through the ranks of abuse and neglect and opioid addiction and domestic violence and all of that, end up in foster care and not have had some kind of exposure, whether it's watching your parents, whether it's having other people approach you, whether it's coming into a foster home where there are unrelated children in foster homes, and those children have two things that allows them to act out sexually. They have time and they have opportunity. And it's not that they're bad kids. We have to start with that premise. It's not at all that these are children who have any kind of offensive behavior. It's just kids who have been exposed to it. So we're going to talk about that. What I really want you guys to come away with at the end is to feel somewhat comfortable about talking about this, to develop some kind of strategies for dealing with it. And you're in a much better place now with the teaching family model than you ever were with the level system. And if any of you were around the FUMCH corral during the level system era, it was a very, very bad punitive type of process for children. And I can tell you, having been there in the early days of the 98 to 2002, coming back, that with a lot of the childcare staff, there's very little understanding of why these kids were doing some of the things that they were doing. And there was a lot of shaming that made it a whole lot worse. So what we're going to try to do today is and for the next 4 weeks, is kind of help you take a look at that. So today we're going to talk about the difference between normal and abnormal behaviors, because all kids have normal sexual behavior. So we want you to be able to identify the difference. We're going to talk about how to respond to those behaviors. We're going to talk about interventions for kids with sexual behavior, things that you can do. And because this training was developed specifically for foster caregivers, the last module was the role of the caregiver in clinical treatment. And that's been a tough sell for a lot of foster parents because they don't really want to get involved with this. And it has been a big sell with my therapists who want the foster caregivers to get involved and to help the foster caregivers to understand they can really be very helpful with these things. Just as when we were in the old level system days, they could be very unhelpful. And so those are the 4 modules that we're going to look at. So is everybody okay with getting started? Okay. And again, once I share the screen, you are teeny tiny little dots up there in that camera. So if you want to say anything, please feel free to unmute the mic and share. It's a much better experience if you do. When I say kids are sexual from the day they're born, it's just a normal part of growing up. It's why little boy babies play with their equipment when their mothers are changing their diapers. It's just a normal part of growing up. And if you grow up in what we would call a normal household, you have parents or caregivers who are kind of helping you along the way to say, no, honey, we don't do that in public. No, honey, you do that in your bedroom. That's all part of how we grow up and we teach kids what the normal part of sexuality is. I believe it was in 2015. Sometimes I get my dates mixed up. But there was a very young child that was brought into the Enterprise campus. He was only 5 years old, and his name was Micah. And I remember Micah coming in because I was over there at that point. I think I might have been one of my stints of acting VP or something. I don't know what I was doing there. But he was little, he was cute, he was blonde, and he was extremely sexualized. And as we looked at Micah's history, Micah was one of the more severe cases that I had worked with, where his parents had brought him into their bed and put him between them. He was maybe 12 months old when they started doing this. So Micah grew up being sexually stimulated, and it's a normal physiological response. The problem with having it when you're 5 is that your brain isn't quite caught up with what's going on with your body. So you don't know what to do with any of this. And Micah was an extreme puzzle for the therapist who had him at the time. I can tell you that, because she kept coming into me saying, oh my God, what am I going to do with him? But at one point, I think he was in Gilbert. It was before Gilbert was Caminos. And he put a little note on another kid's bed. He put it on the kid's bed and said, do you want to have sex? Yes or no? And he wanted the kid to X out whatever the answer was. So she came flying over to me with a note, said, what am I going to do? Well, we really had to be kind of creative with Micah, because for one thing, if you look at that level of abuse, Micah had no idea what a normal father and mother did. He just didn't. And we sometimes you just have to be creative. I think what we ended up doing with Micah is that I bought a series of Berenstein Bears books for the therapist. Now, if you know the Berenstein Bears, if you have kids yourself, the Berenstein Bears have very traditional role models. The mama bear does certain things, the papa bear does certain things. The Berenstein Bears go on vacation, they plan a meal, they take a trip to the park, they do all kinds of normal things. It was the best we could think of for Micah to say, this is what a mommy does, and this is what a daddy does, and this is what a mommy doesn't do, and this is what a daddy doesn't do. So sometimes these things can become very difficult to figure out how to deal with, and you just have to do it. So I would like you to unmute your mics, because I'm going to ask you some questions, and I do need you to answer, okay? We'll pause while you figure out how to unmute the mic. Thank you.
We got it.
You'll be very good at this by the time this is over, I promise you. All right, what I want to do, and I really want you to all think about this, is how did you learn about sex? Everybody learns about sex in a different way. So who in the room, and you can raise your hand if you're not comfortable talking, who in the room learned about sex from their mother or father? And I don't think
Who did learn about it from their parent?
Yes. You know, usually nobody raises their hand to this. I think I see 2 hands up. Who put their hand up?
There were 3. It was LaSavion, Haley, and myself.
Man, you're an enlightened group, I'll tell you that. So
well, Haley's mom's a nurse. Of course, she would teach her child about sex. And safe sex, I'm hoping.
Yeah. Bless this is not what I signed up for.
So I did this, and I don't know if Angela was in the room when I did this. I did this at the Enterprise campus, and actually we went around the table. We were in Hardin Hall, and I said, did your family tell you anything about sex to keep you from doing, quotes, bad things? And one of the child care staff said, he was a guy, said, my mother told me that if I masturbated, I would pee potato chips. And that image is pretty painful. So, but everybody had something. And it, interestingly, it fell within cultural lines. It's pretty cultural. But I can tell you, and I can show you if you can see it, I don't know. I grew up in an Irish American household in the 60s. And if you know anything about Irish Americans, we are not known for discussing this kind of thing. It is especially in the 60s. People did not talk about things like this. And hold on, I'm going to unshare the screen just for a minute. Okay, see this little book? This book is called Growing Up and Liking It. And this was my mother's idea of sex education. And you can Google this book. It's on Amazon. It came out in the 60s. Kotex put it out. And it is actually very, very funny because it talks about all of the myths about what we taught girls in the 60s about getting their period, and they couldn't wash their hair, they couldn't take a shower, they couldn't exercise, and they couldn't go on dates. I mean, essentially, you were supposed to closet yourself, apparently, while you were having your period. But this was my mom's idea. And she brought it up to my bedroom one day and turned her back on me and shoved it at me through the bedroom door and said, "Here." And I said, "Okay, thanks, Ma." But that was her way of teaching me something. Needless to say, I didn't learn very much, but again, it's very cultural. It depends on how old you are. It depends on what culture you came from. So who else raised their hand besides the daughter of the nurse?
Liz Savion and myself.
Okay, Savion, tell me about your experience.
It was just pretty point blank to the point with my mama. My mama told me, you know, what body part was what. She told me like what body parts a woman has. She did it way better than my grandmama did, because my grandma told me that two people spit in a cup and then they put the water together and that's how a baby comes. And so my question was, well, how the baby get in the mama's stomach? My grandma said, well, the woman got to drink the water real fast so the baby get too big. And I was about 7 then when my mama had done already told me about where babies come from. And I sat there and told my grandma where babies come from, how they made and everything.
Do you mind if I ask you how old you are?
31.
Okay, so your grandma, when she was telling you this story, was probably somebody more in my era who
Yes,
grew
ma'am.
up and probably hadn't been taught very much herself.
Right.
Because we didn't. There was one, and again, I don't know if Angela remembers any of this, but there was his name was Frank Raymer. He was one of your childcare staff on Enterprise, and he said that his father drove him around by Lake Monroe and said, "See those alligators out there? There's a boy alligator and there's a girl alligator." And that's how that happens. So it's a wonder that any of us procreated at a certain point, because we didn't get very good experience. What about the rest of you? If you didn't raise your hand that your parents taught you, who taught you?
My friends at school, yep.
Yeah.
My
Almost
sister.
always. It's almost always your friends at school. And do you think they know any more than you do? They didn't actually give you the straight scoop either. So
So this one did.
say what?
I said the one that taught me did. She was rather sexually active in well, I don't even know what grade it was. It was at Pinetta, so it was before 8th grade.
Before 8th grade?
Yes, ma'am.
That was her friend.
Yep.
They gave her the scoop.
Well,
My sister taught me, and she was 4 years older than me. So I'm guessing it's around the time that she learned, but then she told me, and I was in elementary school at the time. And then I saw a video in passing on the TV, and she was like, "That's what I was talking about." And so that's how I learned.
well, like I said, it is a miracle that any of us procreated, because nobody was taught correctly. I mean, if your grandma's talking about water in a cup, and drinking the water in a cup.
I grew up on a farm, so the animals procreated. We often we brought in bulls to inseminate cows, and literally that's how my parents talked about sex. Like, it was very technically effective. Not necessarily about the romance of it, but the technical aspects of sex.
Well, I was at a vet one day when they were trying to, what do they call it when they bring the male dog in and they impregnate the female dog? I think there's a term for it. But it was terrifying. I mean, I was out there with my cat. The female was
Yeah, it's a stud service for the dog.
stud service. Yeah, it wasn't pretty. It was pretty scary. So, but I guess what you all probably were taught with a certain amount of love, I hope. I mean, people weren't trying to scare you. Your grandma might have been trying to scare you with the water thing, but people weren't trying to scare you. The problem that you're going to face with these kids is that the way they were taught anything is usually scary or hurtful or in some way it's certainly not what you want a child to be exposed to. So that's why we really have to look at the way these kids are reacting. And I certainly spent enough time around the fire at Enterprise. I haven't ever been to the Madison campus, I will say it. Micah jumps back and forth between those campuses like a jackrabbit, but I don't. So, but I expect from talking to her that your kids are pretty much the same. And they've almost all had some kind of sexual exposure. So that's why we're doing a lot of this. Although I've not heard the glass of water thing. That's a new one for me. I usually get some pretty good stories when I do that. So one of the videos that I sometimes use when I do this is My Big Fat Greek Wedding. If any of you remember that movie, in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the woman was marrying a non-Greek, and her mother and all of her aunts got together the morning before her wedding and talked about how they were going to behave in the bedroom, and she was uncomfortable, and it's a comedy, so it was really very funny. But you hopefully all had these exposures with loving parents. You guys can see the screen, right? I just made sure you
Yes,
guys,
ma'am.
okay,
We can see it. Yes, ma'am.
thought I should have just probably checked with you on that. So when we kind of talk about all this, it really is different cultures. Different cultures do handle this differently. And my generation and Savion's grandmother's generation handled it differently than other people. It depends on what your exposure. It's funny that you're talking about the stud service and all of that, because you're living in a somewhat rural area where that might have been you might have had that experience. It depends on where you come from. Usually, if I do this training in any kind of like an urban area with people who grew up like in New York City or whatever, almost everybody says that they learned about sex from their friends, and not always the correct way either. But what we have to come out with is that we are now trying to look at this through the lens of the way you grew up, the way you were taught about this, the age that you are, because I expect you're all a lot younger than I am. But that doesn't always change things. So let's kind of take a look at, I sent you guys this handout, and I believe I sent you this sheet. And if I didn't, you let me know and I will send it to you. But this really does break down usual and expected sexual development in kids, because you're always going to see, starting in preschool and going up into adolescence, you're going to see an exposure, an increase in sexual content. And it doesn't have to be bad, and it doesn't have to be uncomfortable. What you as child care workers, you as parents, you as guardians, your job is just to guide your kids into what's normal and what's not okay. And that's why we look at some of this. So you're going to see, I mean, you do see little kids touching their bodies, having little tiny kids have a lot of interest in bathroom activities. And it's really, remember when you were toilet training your own little kids and they wanted to see what they did after they did it in the potty? That's their kind of like beginning of getting in touch with what's happening with their bodies, what's coming out of their bodies, what's going into their bodies. And it's just pretty normal stuff. And it's pretty easy to get them going in a different direction. As kids get a little bit older, we used to call it the latency age, that 5 to 10-year-old age. Think about like third, fourth graders on a playground. What do third and fourth graders do on a playground with the opposite sex? Because it's always the same thing.
Say it louder. They chase each other.
Yeah, they chase each other. And they've always chased each other, and they're always going to chase each other. The thing is, they never catch each other, because if they caught each other, then there would have to be some kind of actual progression into the contact. But kids of that age just know that it's sort of exciting, and they chase each other around. They might get into things like spin the bottle, those, whatever those kinds of things are. But by the time your kids get to be pre-adolescent or adolescent, their bodies have started to change. They have some kind of sexual feelings, and they may at that point, and probably do, start to act out sexually. Now, look at this chart just for a minute and think about the fact that maybe your first physical contact, your first sexual contact with your father, your brother, your uncle, was when you were 5 or 6 or 7. That ups the ante very much on what you're going to do at this stage. And let me just ask you, when you guys, and Alexa can, I hate to say her name because then my echo is going to start talking to me, but let me ask you, when you do your intake, how much of this is explored? How much of the sexual content or the sexual activity, is there a part on your intake that goes into that?
Not necessarily. In the first session, I talk to the kids and do, like, within that first week, usually we do a biopsychosocial assessment. And sometimes there'll be things that come out there, especially in the list of behaviors and traumatic experiences. Some of there, it'll be like sexually inappropriate behavior, or sexual promiscuity, and sometimes things will come out there. I also explained to them that we're going to do human trafficking training once we're done with all the assessments and the treatment plan. And then during that training, there'll be things that come out sometimes.
That's fantastic, actually. You know, the whole human trafficking thing is always so interesting to me when I watch people do it with kids in residential centers, because a lot of these kids have absolutely no idea that what happened to them shouldn't have happened to them. So,
Mhm.
and I don't know, I mean, Madison's a little more rural. I'm guessing it's not as easy for people to stalk your campus as it is the Enterprise campus, but
Right.
there's a lot of that goes on in Enterprise. So,
Mhm.
and again, I'm not in charge of the forms at FUMSH. We've had to change our forms and make sure that we get at a lot of this. We also had to change our forms in terms of asking them about their gender orientation and their sexual identity, because there's also, I mean, we all know that wherever you are on the political spectrum is not my point. Kids right now have a lot of exposure to different kind of sexual identities, and they question it a lot. So if you have been molested, if you have had any kind of sexual exposure, I can tell you the very first thing that the boys do is say, I must be gay. So we have to really use some time exploring some of that. But this is, if you want to just use this as your benchmark, this is usual and expected sexual development. We expect kids to do this. We expect them to behave this way. It doesn't mean that they're bad, and it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. And I say that because the biggest problem that I have always had in trying to train childcare staff is that you haven't necessarily, as childcare staff, been exposed to this maybe in your formal education. So, and yet you're the front lines, man. I mean, these kids come in and you are right there with them, and you have to figure out how to handle them. So it's you're at a disadvantage in a way unless you have some exposure to training. So when do I, and again, I want you to leave your mics unmuted because I want you to answer the question. When should we become concerned about kids' behaviors? There are situations where a behavior is concerning. There are situations where it's not concerning at all. And I'm assuming that you have treatment teams the same way they do in enterprise, that you probably have some conversation with your childcare staff, or that you have just, I think you still have changeovers where the two sets of house parents talk about what's happened and changing over the behavior to, or the situation to the new people coming in. And a lot of those discussions would take place then. Should we be concerned about this behavior? Is this something we need to be concerned about? Because your kids, and I think that you're right, Alexa, a lot of these kids don't come in telling you what happened. I did a sand tray training for all the therapists on the Enterprise campus, and they all left that day with little mini sand trays. And it was Deb Mahoney at the time, she's retired now. She put her sand tray on the floor, and this little girl had just been admitted. She was 9 years old. And she came in and saw the sand tray and said, "Miss Deb, what is that?" And Deb said, "Well, you can play with it if you want." So this little girl, I believe her name was Faith, built a scene in the sand tray where there was a baby on the bottom and there was a male doll on top of the baby. And she kept saying, "The perpetrator is on top of the baby, Miss Deb." And when Deb tried to say to her, "Well, what is perpetrator? That's a big word," she wouldn't talk to her. She just kept saying, "The perpetrator's on top of the baby." This kid had not been admitted for sexual trauma. This kid had been, in quotes, admitted by her mother because she said she was acting up. Well, she was 9 years old, and a couple of weeks later, she had an outbreak of genital herpes, and then she had an outbreak of herpes of the mouth. And needless to say, we switched her treatment to sexual trauma treatment. But how did we find out about it? We found out about it because she built a scene in the sand tray and said, "This is what happened." And I would say that about your private admissions. I think you need to be careful with your private admissions because they don't always tell you the truth about why these kids are here. And I see that you're shaking your head, so you know that to be true. Okay, the reason I use Michael Jackson here is distinguishing between normal behavior and abnormal behavior. Wherever you fell on the musical spectrum or the spectrum of Michael Jackson, there is no question that Michael Jackson was a very troubled individual. And to this day, I don't think we really have any clear idea what happened to him. I mean, he grew up as a child star. He grew up in a blended family with a lot of older siblings in the entertainment industry. So if there was ever going to be a situation where somebody might be exposed to something abnormal sexually, it was probably for Michael Jackson. And if you remember any of the things that happened to him, think about him for a minute. What might you have been concerned about if you were just looking at this as a childcare worker or a therapist from the outside? What might you have been concerned about with his behaviors? Where did he live? Does anybody remember where he lived?
Neverland. It was like a theme park.
Right, right. It was like a theme park. And who do you invite to a theme park?
Lots of children.
Lots of children, yeah. The very last time that he was, that was a trial, it was very, very clear in my mind, having done sexual trauma work for my whole adult life, that there was no question that he had molested these kids. Did I think he wanted to hurt them? No, I don't think he wanted to hurt them at all. I think his behavior was extremely childlike, and that's where you got Neverland. And that's where you got the theme park and inviting the kids to his house. What's that? I forget what that actor's name is. He's on The Young and the Restless now. He plays Devon. He was a child star, and he's now an adult, and he talks about being brought to Neverland and Michael Jackson being, quotes, very kind to him. but wanting him to sleep in the bed with him and wanting to be very close to him physically. And how he ended up as normal as he did, I have no idea. But unfortunately, a lot of those young men who gave very credible stories were disallowed, and they were disallowed because the American culture has got such a star factor around Michael Jackson. If you remember, because maybe I followed it more than people, normal people, but he would come out of the courtroom and there would be hundreds of people cheering for him. And at one point he got up on the van that drove him there and was dancing to his music, and it was all like a circus. But his behaviors were very abnormal, from the living situation that he fashioned for himself to attract young children. He was in a very unique position to say to a mother or a father, bring your kid over to my house, and it was always boys. Bring your child over to my house, and mothers were very flattered that he would do that, and they would bring their kids. And do you think those kids would then go back to their mother and say, this was not exactly what I wanted? The kids were confused, and as they grew up to be adults and testified at that last trial before he died, they were completely confused still about what had happened to them. So
Barbara, do you think that was all a product of his issues and his problems were the product of the way he grew up and the things that would have happened to him as a child star growing up in the time that he grew up and the things he was exposed to at an early age?
You know, we've never been able to prove that, but historically, I would say probably yes. I mean, if you look at the way a lot of these, don't ever put your kids in show business. I mean, obviously they all end up to be wacky. Look at that poor Britney Spears and Colleen McCulkin and all the rest of them. But he had so many risk factors when he was growing up. Wasn't he the youngest? He was the youngest boy, I think, in the family.
Yes, ma'am.
And he was the star. So, and we've never, I mean, obviously those secrets are going to go to the grave of the Jackson family. So, and I don't know that we will ever know. But if you just look at historically, I would say more than likely. I mean, you don't just wake up and become what Michael Jackson became. And it went deeper with his whole identity issues and lightening the skin and changing his face and all of that type of thing. And he was a very tortured individual. But I would probably venture an educated guess that, yeah, that's probably where some of that came from. And he's just a prime example of the fact that we then didn't convict him. And those young men probably suffered some pretty extreme damage because nobody wanted to believe them. The American public didn't want to believe that Michael Jackson was doing all these things. And I don't know that Michael Jackson wanted to believe he was doing all these things. So it's a very sad commentary on the way we look at some of our entertainment. So if any of these things are observed, these are the things we would want to explore a little bit further. And we're going to talk a little bit about child on child, because I know that in residential, child on child, when I was at the Enterprise campus, I can remember saying to one of the therapists, if you call this in again, I'm going to break your fingers. Do not call in child on child, because for one thing, the law enforcement doesn't want anything to do with child on child. They're just going to turn it right back over to the hotline. The hotline has told me that they're going to turn it right back over to the therapist. So nobody wants to deal with it. And all it does is really confuse the kids and confuse you. So, but what do we need to be concerned with? If you see kids doing any of these sexual activities with kids that are not their friends, if you see a big age difference, if you see a 14-year-old going after a 6-year-old, or doing anything to groom a 6-year-old, we have a lot of that at Circle of Friends. I don't know what that age differential is, but we have a lot of, right now on our caseloads, we've got at least 3 or 4 6-year-old daughters or girls in the family that were molested by 14-year-old brothers and 13, 14-year-old brothers. When we get the cases come from case management. And the ones that are referred to us are the child victims. And what we always try to say is, okay, we're going to open both of them, because obviously this 14-year-old didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to turn into a sexual tyrant. So invariably, when we get into those cases, we find that this has gone through, in many cases, sadly, through generations. But it was one of my first, I can tell you, my first exposures when I moved here from Massachusetts. And I had Blanton Cottage at the time. And Blanton Cottage was, I think there were 8, like 13 to 15-year-old girls in there. And this was in 1998. And sexual trauma work had really evolved in Massachusetts at that point, and I did a lot of it. But I came and I discovered, kind of inadvertently, not as planfully as you may have done through your intakes, I discovered very inadvertently that all of these girls had been molested. All of them were untreated. All of them were unreported, because it was just part of the culture. And at the time, you guys were not doing Medicaid. You were doing all private referrals. So where were these kids coming from? These kids were coming from, I used to call them the highly placed Methodist referrals. They were coming from Methodist ministers out in Okeechobee or someplace, who would call the children's home and say, okay, so-and-so is living with their grandma and he's acting up, and we need to put him someplace where he can be raised, or we need to put her someplace where she can stop acting out. And then we'd find out that, and then I found out that all of these kids had had no treatment at all. So that kind of was the beginning of my job there, was to try to, number one, I had to report it. I didn't know that it hadn't been reported. So when we look at any of these behaviors, we're going to be concerned about it. You're going to be concerned if you see a kid doing something that they shouldn't know how to do. If you see a 4-year-old who's playing with their Barbie dolls and suddenly starts humping their Barbie dolls, should a 4-year-old know how to hump a Barbie doll? Probably not. One of my earlier experiences was on the Sexual Information Network in Massachusetts, and this probably goes back to the late 90s. And we would have to go in and interview the kids who had reported sexual trauma. We had to do it behind, like, they were behind a one-way mirror. We had cops there, we had attorneys, not a lot of pressure there. But what you would see is that the kids would sit and I would start to play with them, or I would draw pictures with them, or I would give them some toys to play with. And they invariably turned these toys into sexual objects because they didn't know any better. So, and that was really how we came to a lot of our conclusions, was not by what they said. And I would say the same thing to you guys. It's not what they say to you, it's what they do. And if you see kids who are kind of fixated on other people's body parts, or fixated on masturbation, fixated on doing anything that has to do with sexuality with older kids or kids that are much younger than them, or you as a child care staff have made repeated efforts to say, no, you don't do that in the Walmart parking lot. That's something that you do in private. If you make repeated efforts to redirect and you're not getting any place, then we would be concerned.
Barbara, you mentioned that if it's a big age difference, and you were talking about younger kids, but in like our cottage, we have 11, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-olds. And we have an 11-year-old who is always making sexualized comments towards our 14-year-olds, and they are clearly interested. Is that a big age difference? It's 3 years, and in my head, that's an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and that's a big age difference in my head. But in reality, is that a big age difference? Because what is a big age difference?
Well, it's a big age difference, and it's a concerning behavior. So, I mean, you don't expect an 11-year-old to make any kind of sexual overtures to anybody of any age. So you might expect them to run around on the park in the playground and chase each other, but uh, that's an interesting situation that you have there, because look at that for a minute. You have an 11-year-old who's making sexual overtures to a 14-year-old who's clearly older and should be more in a position of power. But it sounds like your 11-year-old is feeling like maybe they're in a position of power, which should kind of give you
I mean, to be fair, she makes sexual overtures towards our adult female staff. So she's always got something to say about somebody's booty or how they're dressed or trying to rub up on them, gesticulating sexually. Like please let me say, this is not just the 11-year-old. We have two 11-year-olds and they both have sexualized behaviors. All of our girls, we have 8 girls and all of them have sexualized behaviors. Like this is not, this is not uncommon here. This is a common theme in our cottage. Like we're reading this in the room and we're saying, oh, these numbers apply to this resident. These numbers apply to that resident. Like there's not a resident that we have that we couldn't assign at least one, possibly 2 of these numbers to, if not more.
And that's why we're doing this, because
Okay.
you probably have nobody there that has not had some kind of sexual exposure. And those are all huge red flags. I mean, I don't know who has children of their own in this room, but if you do have children of your own or nieces or nephews or whatever, you don't expect them to act like this. And your kids do act like this. So it's your norm. And that's why you have a big job trying to figure out how do you, number one, stop the behavior, and number 2, start to re-educate these kids on what normal is. And that's a big job. If they've had this their whole life, they don't know any different. So, but no, I agree with you. When I got to Blanton, I think I'd been in Florida for 3 weeks, and Massachusetts is a pretty liberal state, and I was just used to that because that's where I came from. But I came in one day and I found the child care staff sitting on the front steps of Blanton Cottage, and she looked like she'd gone 3 rounds in a bad fight. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I found all of the girls." Now, at the time, I don't know what your cottages are like, but at the time, those cottages had 2 in a bedroom, 2 in a bedroom, and a shared bathroom. So every night, 4 kids had exposure to each other in the bathroom.
Oh my God, that sounds terrible. We have individual bedrooms and bathrooms here, but that sounds like a horrible situation before you even finish the story.
It was a horrible situation, and it's since been corrected. But at the time, yeah, every night, and they could go in. Well, they did. 4 of them got into the bathroom. I think it's one of the examples I'm going to talk to you about, and got into the bathroom. They were all acting out sexually with each other. And then, because sort of like what you're describing, there were 13-year-olds and then there was a 15-year-old, and they all turned on the 15-year-old when they were caught, because they were making a lot of noise. And they turned on the 15-year-old and said, "It's her fault. She's the one that did it. She's a lesbian. She says she's gay. It's all her fault." Well, I will shame the children's home for just a moment, because the response to this was, I got there and they wanted me to call the police. And I said, "Why am I calling the police?" And I won't even tell you whose decision that was, because it was a long time ago. But so I called the police, and the policeman arrives, and I remember him saying to me, "Well, why are you calling me?" And I said, "Because I was told to." So he said, "Well, so this is just like a CYA call, because we're not going to do anything with this." However, I will tell you, that was kind of I almost got in the car and drove up 95 and went back home that day. It was awful. But what did we do? I ended up, I still have the paperwork from it. I ended up sitting with each one of those kids and saying, "Tell me what happened, and tell me a little bit about yourself." And that's how all of their sexual traumas came out. And it kind of was the beginning of me being able to deal with them. Now, what about the poor childcare staff? I think I sent her off with a gift card to the Olive Garden or something. I mean, she was just like destroyed. but we didn't protect them at that point. You know, your cottages are probably kind of like Waller Jeter is. I think Waller Jeter is all private bathrooms and bedrooms. And your cottages are fairly newer. When were your cottages built?
2014,
13.
14-ish.
14 was.
Yeah. But
14 was the first time we had kids. You
I-
you refer to the things on the Enterprise campus, and I can honestly say that except for Angela, most of us have never spent any or a significantly limited amount of time on the Enterprise campus. So we have no frame of reference when it comes to Enterprise.
Angela, do you have a frame of reference?
Is Waller Jeter like our cottage?
Yes, it's like Waller Jeter and Gilbert. Where they have
I was
their
just about
own
to say that
individual
too.
bathrooms. They have their own bathroom and rooms. Nothing is
Mhm.
connected.
Angela, how long have you worked at the children's home?
10 years.
10 years?
Yes, ma'am.
So you came in 2012.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. I think maybe by the time Angela got there, things had evolved a little bit in terms of they had to rebuild the cottages. They had fire inspections and they had state inspections, and the cottages had to be reconfigured so that there was only one kid in a bedroom and then one child that had exposure to a bathroom. They also had other things like jalousied windows, which are an absolute fire hazard. So they had to like really kind of revamp all of that. But it wasn't that long ago that we really didn't understand how to take care of any of this. And Angela, what you worked in Gilbert, right?
Yes, I started out in Gilbert.
Okay, that's
Miss
right.
Angela had Micah.
Oh, you did. That's right. You did. Oh my gosh.
I had Micah at the end, but Miss Angela had Micah the whole time.
Well, Micah was a very sad little boy. And, you know, it's one of those things where you don't ever know what happened to him because these kids get moved and then we don't know what the end of the story is. So it's one of the difficulties of working in child welfare. But
Yeah, but one of the hurtful things was at the end when he was being moved, they didn't tell him that he was leaving. And I'm the one who had to go to the school because at that time the caseworkers couldn't check him out of school. I had to go get him out of school, and I was in the car, and when he got ready to get in the car with the caseworker, he was holding on to my leg for dear life because he kept saying, I don't know where I'm going from here. I don't want to go nowhere else. I want to stay. It was real sad.
well, working with child welfare is very sad. It really is. And part of it is that you never know what the end of the story is. So, I mean, I've been in this field since 1974 in a variety of, I've been a case manager, I've been a CPI, I've been a therapist. It never changes. You don't know what the end of the story is. So the one thing, and Angela might have some perspective on this, is that I do think that you guys have gotten 1,000% better about the way these things are handled. And from what I gather from many conversations with Micah, that you guys really should be proud of what you're doing up there because it sounds like, for one thing, you're smaller, so you can control what you do a little bit better. It's hard on the Enterprise campus. There's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of different people, and there's a lot of different people who have different ideas about how this should work. So you have a cohesive force. You've got Micah, who's a good leader. You've got all of you, and you can really do some good work, which is what I've said to Micah 1,000 times. Close the gates around Madison and don't let anybody else in. And then maybe you have a chance of really doing some good work with this. But it has evolved. It really has. I mean, what Angela's talking about happens over and over with these kids who have no idea where they're going. Caseworker shows up and puts them in the car and drives them someplace, and they don't know where they're going. So how can we expect them to be any better than what we're seeing right here with the way some of these kids are treated? So, but I'm sorry, Angela, I'd forgotten you had him. And you had, I don't know, you had another kid I can see him because I have a picture of him. Um, but I can't remember his name, but
Arthur?
I'm sorry,
Arthur?
perhaps. You had a boy who was pooping in plastic bags and hiding them in his closet.
Xavier?
It was Xavier. Thank you. Um, and he was another kid who we knew had been molested, who wasn't being treated for that. He went home for Christmas. His mother stole his drugs. He came back. He didn't have the drugs because she had taken them while he was home. But we had Danielle Collette was the therapist at the time, and I can actually show you the book.
When she says drugs, she means meds. Oh, okay.
Yeah, he took his meds. This book was written in 1986. It's called It Happens to Boys Too. And it was written by members of a rape crisis center who met with sex offenders in Summers Prison in Connecticut. The reason I keep it is because there are almost no books for boys. And Danielle read this book to her boys group. And Xavier said, on the way out, this happened to me too. And it was his uncle. And I mean, we already suspected. I mean, there's not a whole lot of reason for people to save their poop, except that something bad has happened. And it was the same kind of awful situation where the CPI came out, the mother denied it. The allegation was unfounded. That's the worst thing that can happen to these kids when they finally disclose, is that the allegations are then unfounded, and then nobody believes them. And he somewhat deteriorated after that, although I do believe, and maybe you weren't involved with him, Angela, I do believe he ended up leaving for some kind of a permanent placement. But
He moved with his aunt in Tallahassee.
yeah, and we don't know if he's still there. We don't know what happened, but
I talked to him about 2 years ago, and that was it. That was the last time I talked with him.
He was still there when we checked on him about 2 years ago, and he was doing well.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully he's still doing well.
You know, I'm always glad to hear that, because with a lot of the kids that I have worked with who are now older, I was presenting something to one of the child care staff, and Yoke Hotel remembered the kid. I was talking about him, and she said, I remember him. And I said, do you have any idea what happened to him? And she said, he's in prison. And you never want to hear that. But, you know, with some of these kids, I don't know how things could be any better for them. But that's how we found out about Xavier, because she read the book, and he said, yeah, that happened to me too. So I keep on sharing the screen just so I can see you, because it's really hard for me to, I can just see little pinheads there. All right, let's talk a little bit about child on child. And I don't know what your policy is, but I can tell you that this is the DCF policy. And this is the policy that I enforced when I was acting VP at residential. And it's the policy that I enforce with my therapists, is that there are 3 things that are necessary to report a child on child. And one is coercion. There has to be force involved. There has to be some level. It's not an 8-year-old playing with an 8-year-old. There has to be some level of force or coercion. There has to be some size or age difference. And to go back to your 11-year-old with the 14-year-old, it's almost more disturbing to me that the younger kid feels in a position of power over the older kid, because that should tell you a little bit about perhaps what's happened to that 11-year-old. But you have to have lack of consent. You cannot have 2 12-year-olds who, like the girls, you can't have 4 kids get in the bathroom at night and play around with each other. That is not child on child, which is exactly, as I recall, in 1998, what the police officer said to the director of residential care. This is not an issue for child on child. Let me ask you, what is the policy for you guys? When do you call in child on child, or do you call in child on child?
Honestly, if we have any incident of children touching each other, Micah has us do the online reporting system. And
Every
then
time. Any type of
every
contact, if it's a touch on the butt, anything, we have to call it in with my.
right, if it's anything, we do the online report or the call in, and then DCF either does something with it or they send us the email that says this does not meet our criteria, and we do our incident report and move along with our day. But we always report.
Well, and you know, of course, I think there's value for you guys in terms of data collection, because what you're coming out with is a data trail on how many incidents and what levels they are, because you are doing an incident report. From a forensic standpoint, from a legal standpoint, nothing's going to happen with that. Sometimes it just scares the kids. But from the DCF standpoint, that's when you report. For our purposes at Circle of Friends, we're in a very different position than you're in. So we use it as a treatment issue because we're in a different legal position than you guys are. You guys are responsible for guardianship, you're responsible for custody, and you probably want to be collecting that data. So she's probably absolutely right to have you do it. We don't do it because therapeutically there's no value in it, and nothing is going to happen. Do we file an incident report? Absolutely. And do we use it as a part of factoring in our treatment and how we're going to treat? Yes, we do. But we don't do anything legally. And I can tell you that the law enforcement, the last time, there was a little boy named Justin on the campus at Enterprise. He was from Putnam County. And if you know anything about Putnam County, it is extremely poor county, and the incidents of incest that come out of Putnam County are extremely high. And he was no exception to that. But he kept touching people. He wasn't doing anything bad. He was like touching people's butts and just touching. And they kept calling child on child in. And I found that the police officer sitting out in the lobby with his little laptop, and he's filing a report. And he said to me, I'm not going to do anything with this. You don't have to keep calling about this kid, because every time I have to come out here, I scare the bejesus out of him. And so I really just said, we're not going to do that anymore. File an incident report, say this is what he did, and use it in your treatment. So, but you know, again, you guys are under an entirely different situation than outpatient. So you have to do that. But from a legal standpoint, they're not going to do anything with it.
Well, I think what we use it for, not just the calling or the reporting to DCF, is we use it as the opportunity to do a kind of a staffing or a triage amongst our staff on, is the level of supervision appropriate for the child, and do they need to go to a higher level of supervision for their behaviors. So. Yeah,
because basically it's a treatment issue, isn't it? It's not a legal issue, it's a treatment issue. So actually, the reason that Family Services of Metro Orlando asked me to do this certification all these years ago is because they kept getting into so much trouble in their foster homes, and they were not using sexual safety plans, and they weren't protecting the kids from each other. Kids in foster care need to be protected from each other. Not because they're bad, but they don't have any boundaries themselves. They may not have had any kind of proper sexual education themselves, so they don't know. So they do certain things. I worked at an agency called Neighbor to Family. It was up in Daytona, and they went so far as to put, which was, I don't know that the department was all that excited about it, but they put electric fences in the kids' bedrooms. And it didn't zap them or anything. It just, if a kid got up and tried to leave his bedroom in the night, it went off. An alarm went off in the poor foster parent's bedroom. So it was, I don't know that they're still doing that. I think that was probably a response about 10, 12 years ago, that maybe we'll try that. Say again?
Wow. We're just flabbergasted that someone thought doing that was a good idea.
Well, it's interesting, and it is funny. I'm kind of enjoying your responses, because you're obviously doing a lot of the right things, But I have to tell you, over the years, we have done a lot of the wrong things because we always didn't know what the right thing was. You have to understand that the treatment of sexual trauma has evolved from the 90s. We didn't even know. I mean, sexual trauma goes back to the Roman times, but we didn't know it. As child welfare people, we didn't know it. So we got kind of woke up one morning in the 90s and said, oh my God, we need to do something about this. And I watched this evolve over time. I watched us evolve from not protecting kids at all to letting 4 kids be in the bathroom every night to not allowing kids to be in bedrooms with each other. The whole electric fence thing was a little era that we went through. And
Seriously? Wait, but I'm going to pause you. Seriously, that was like a common practice, electric fence in bedrooms? That was a common practice?
it was only a common practice at Neighbor to Family. And Neighbor to Family was an agency that worked with sibling
The
groups.
door? Okay.
So
Okay, I clearly am using my farm girl brain, not my this was an alarm for the door brain, because in my head, electric fence is a whole different thing than alarming doors. Okay, I'm just not.
You called electric doors. You missed the part where she said it wouldn't shock them.
Yes. Okay.
yeah,
Okay, I'm sorry. Continue.
we're not talking about zapping kids. We're just talking about alerting foster parents to kids that children have gotten up and that they've opened the door to try to get into another room because
Gotcha.
I would definitely not use electric fence, because when you're talking about electric fence, that's something totally different than an alarm system.
Yeah, like now I put it in the realm of I have friends with an autistic child and they have had door chimes on their doors and it's
Right.
chimes, but it wasn't an electric fence because that's a farm girls in the room are like, oh my God, they were like shocking kids. Oh my God.
Yeah, we were cattle prodding them. We did a lot of dumb things, Neva. I'm telling you, when I first got to college in 1998, now Alexa's probably been on the campus, so you've probably been in Waller Jeter, right?
Yeah, we parents in Waller Jeter.
Yes, I started as a house parent, so I house parented in Waller Jeter, CQ, Gilbert, and Fox Wright.
That's right. Okay, so when you walked in the door of Waller Jeter, to the left, there is now a closet. But at the time, it was a holding cell. And it was a padded room. And if a kid was acting up, you could look out the window and he'd be carried across the campus and put in the holding cell, and the door would lock behind him. And there were carpets on the walls. And he or she, usually it was a boy, had to stay in there until he could be quiet for 15 minutes. So they would set a timer, and if the kid yelled or did anything during the 15 minutes, they reset the timer. So you can imagine how triggering all this was for kids who are already scared. And the first time I saw it, I was totally horrified that they were locking these kids into this closet. I went over there one night because I don't live very far from Enterprise. I went in my pajamas and they had one of my kids in there. And I said, well, let me go in with her. So I sat in there. I was scared in there. So now how did that practice got stopped? Because the department found out about it. And I looked out the window one day and there's the department officials walking across the campus. And
How did we not get closed down for something like that? That blows my mind.
You need to live long enough to see that this stuff just happened. And the state of child welfare in Florida was not terribly evolved in the 90s. It has come a long way since then, but the department made them take the lock off. So they continued to use the room, but they couldn't lock the kid in the room. So we then had a big burly guy who was an ex-law enforcement officer who was now working as a child care worker, who would stand and hold the door closed while the kid wailed on the door and screamed and yelled. So did any of this help? No, it didn't help at all. It just scared the crap out
Did it
of
make
kids.
things worse? Because I can only imagine that would make things so much worse.
Yeah, it did. It made things worse. And that's why we have to keep getting better. That's why we have to say, my God, that was only 20 years ago. We are not talking about the dark ages. It's when I first got there. Um, you might find that there are a lot of very questionable things that go on in small group homes that you guys would probably be appalled about because they're not that regulated and there's not that many people there. And you have a wonderful campus and a wonderful facility and a wonderful leader, but some of these little group homes that are down here that we've worked with are horror shows. So we just need to keep getting better. That's all I would say. I'm not telling you these stories to rag on FUMSH. It was their history. When they keep saying we've been around since 1908, can you imagine what they were doing in 1908? So
It sounds to me a lot like the things they were doing in 1998.
Well, I would have to say, because my first exposure was in 1998, that I watched it get a lot better. I kept coming back over the years. I would come back to do trainings. I would come back to do consultation or whatever. And I certainly did see it get a lot better. Do they have a long way to go? Any childcare institution has a long way to go. I don't know that FUMSH is quite recovered from what happened with the two kids who tried to kill the police officer. That's going to take a long time for that to go away. But you're getting better. You can't worry about them. Aren't you doing a good job up there? I think you are. So
We're working hard every day to do our best.
and I think you should be proud of that because, and I'll tell you something, I have had this conversation with Micah, and so has Kevin Egan multiple times, that you all have a rare opportunity up there to take that little microcosm that you have and make it into something great. And it's a lot easier for you to do it because you're all in sync with each other than to try to do it on the enterprise campus where there are all different people, different levels of education, different levels of exposure, different levels of how they want to handle things, different philosophies. You don't have any of that. You got a really good opportunity, which is why when Mike asked me to do this, I jumped at the chance. Would you guys like to take a little break? We've been at this for almost an hour and a half. Would you like
Yes,
to take?
please. 5 minutes?
That will work. How about 10:30?
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, you
We're
guys
back.
ready to get started again?
Yes, ma'am.
Okie doke. I just texted Micah and said I said your group is doing great. They're appalled at some of the stuff that I'm telling them. They'll probably bend your ear when she gets back. So
I think it's too, you think she's not just gonna send me a text message right now, Barbara?
she what?
She'll just text me.
Okay.
You're her person.
She'll just text me and say, I heard good things. And I'll be like, yay, good things.
Well, it isn't easy to do this since we've had to start doing trainings on Zoom. It's really much more difficult. I mean, Angela knows when we used to do the trainings in the Hardin Hall, it was a lot easier because you had everybody in front of you and everybody could talk and share with each other. The Zoom stuff is tough, but we do the best we can and you guys are doing the best you can. So that's all I ask. All right, let me get back to where we were. All right, we're going to look at just a series of examples, and I want you to try to decide whether you think this is normal or abnormal behavior, and whether, if it's abnormal, should we do anything about it? And I can tell you these are all real examples. I didn't make any of this stuff up. I don't have to because I have lots of material to choose from here. So, all right, which of these behaviors are normal or abnormal and why? You leave your 13-year-old foster son alone with your 8-year-old daughter while you run an errand. You instruct the children to sit in opposite chairs while you watch a movie and tell them you will be right back. You return home to discover your foster son lying on top of your daughter, and both of them are naked from the waist down. And your foster son is humping on top of your daughter, and she is quiet. And he acts startled when you come in the room, and he says, "This isn't what it looks like." So this one's pretty easy. What do you think about this one?
Abnormal?
So what do we have here? We have an 8-year-old, we have a 13-year-old. So we've got an age differential. We have a foster mother who made a tactical error in leaving 2 kids alone, even for a minute. And if you don't think that this happens in foster care, it does. Should it happen? No, they're not supposed to leave the kids alone even for a minute, but it does happen. This is what happens. You know what I said before, that kids in foster care have time and opportunity? If you have time and opportunity and you've had any kind of exposure to any kind of sexual activity yourself, you are more than likely going to take the time and opportunity. But why do you think? It isn't because they're bad, it's because anxiety really creates a lot of this stuff. They get very anxious and they act out very quickly. Somebody want to say something? I could hear something.
No, coughing.
Somebody coughing. Okay, that's when we have different ages, we do have to be really careful. One of the things that we do with our kids in the foster care situation is that we always have the foster parents set up a sexual safety plan. And the sexual safety plan really just says nobody's going to be in the bathroom with anybody else. Nobody's going to be in the bedroom with anybody else. Nobody's going to shut the door when they're in the bedroom unless you're changing your clothes. It's fairly specific. And it's really meant to just say, you as a child have a right to your privacy. You as a child have a right to not have anybody else touch you. And you have to kind of put that on the table. And we have our foster parents just put it on the table. Nobody's going to touch you here. And this is why, and this is how we're going to protect you. But these kind of scenarios, up until a few years ago, when sexual safety plans became very common in foster homes, this kind of stuff happened all the time. All right, the second one is daycare provider reports that your 2-year-old foster son frequently refuses to take naps and tries to put his hand inside the diapers of other sleeping children. She reports that he has tried repeatedly to redirect him, but the behavior persists. Remember when I said if you can't redirect the behavior, it's a concern? And when you examine your foster son, his penis is red and swollen. Now we're talking about a 2-year-old. So what do you think about this one?
I think abnormal.
Yeah. Why?
Because he's trying to do it repeatedly with other kids.
Right.
And they've tried to redirect him, but he isn't redirecting. And I would be really curious as to know why his penis is red and swollen.
Right.
Because even if he's doing self-exploration, would it be red and swollen? I guess if he's doing it a lot, it would be, but.
Because little kids don't know what pressure. Yeah.
I think they figure it out though, don't they? Like.
Not at 2.
I mean, Tucker Terry ran into Missy and was like, look, if you play with it, it grows. That was at 3.
You know, the key here is that if you're playing with yourself for sexual pleasure, even if you're a little tiny kid and you don't understand why you're doing it, you don't hurt yourself. You don't do it to the point of pain. When kids have been sexualized and their anxiety level takes over, they don't know how to stop. So then it becomes obsessive behavior. It becomes behavior that hurts and they can't stop it. And with the little ones, that's one of the things that we have to deal with. And with any little kids, if we see any, especially with the foster parents calling us, on Monday morning saying he's red down there, it's usually because either somebody has done something to them. The weekend visits are champions for kids going home for their weekend visits and coming back with some kind of difficulty. But for a kid to hurt himself is usually a very concerning behavior. And you're right about that. So your 6-year-old foster son tells you that your 15-year-old foster son came into his room while you were making dinner. Your son says the older boy gets his thing out and makes me watch him jerk on it until milk comes out. Would you
Abnormal.
would you expect a 6-year-old to even know how to say that?
No. No.
You know, one of the, actually, I think I twisted this story just a little tiny bit, but we had a 6-year-old girl, and she was referred to us, she was in a foster home, and she was referred to us for behavioral problems, which is what a lot of the foster parents do. They complain about the kids' behavior. So the therapist went out, little girl's name was Olivia, and she had one of those little cutouts of a little girl, and Olivia was drawing on it. And she asked Olivia to draw on the little girl where she was angry, and Olivia was very angry. So she drew all these circles. And then in the area where a man's penis would be, she drew a perfect penis. And she drew it with semen coming out of it. And that's exactly how she described it. That's how we found out that Olivia had been molested. That she said that exact same thing, that this is what happens with the man. He gets his thing out, and then milk comes out of it. And that is, there's a lot of ways to find out the kids have been molested, and it usually isn't because they told you. So with Olivia, I took this picture and I scanned it to the hotline, and they took the call from the hotline. That's one of those kind of stories that I actually think we had a happy ending to, because she was only 6 at the time. And so we switched her treatment immediately to sexual trauma. She eventually, a few years later, ended up moving out of the foster care system and got adopted. So, but had we not had her draw that picture, we never would have known. And I would say when we get to the point of talking about your reactions are absolutely critical, because kids at the oddest times are going to drop some of this stuff on you when you're not expecting it. And one of the times they tend to drop it on you is when do kids feel the most vulnerable? When do we feel the most vulnerable?
I would say that we had a child this weekend, and it wasn't even about sex, but she handed back a sewing machine that she had stolen out of the laundry room. And my reaction to that was I just stood there and looked at her and was like, I had no words. So sometimes it doesn't have to even be about the more difficult things like the sex stuff. Sometimes they hand you back a sewing machine.
And sometimes no words are better than the wrong words. So you
I couldn't find any words, I promise. I just stood there like an idiot. I was just like, okay.
Sometimes no words are better. So one of the things that we talk about a lot with our therapists is that you're going to get disclosures, and you're going to get them at odd times. And when I say kids are most vulnerable at night, when they're tired and when they're going to bed, a lot of these kids drop stuff on the foster parents when they're going to bed at night. And really how you react as a foster parent or a child care worker or child care staff or whatever, pretty critical. But actually what you did probably wasn't bad. All right, your 6-year-old foster son was a victim of severe sexual abuse. Several of his classmates have reported that he has taken them behind bushes, pulled them to the ground, and played with their butts. The children state that they are afraid of your foster son. When asked what he does to them, children say he pulls down their pants and puts sticks upside.
That's abnormal.
Yeah.
Out of mine before.
Actually, this is one of my kids. This was actually the child victim was one of my kids that I was working with in therapy. And he was telling me that this is what happened. Now, this was an older kid, and he was in foster care. And the little boy that was having the sticks in him was 6. But the older foster son was really the one we focused on, because once we found out what he was doing, then we really had to do an assessment, and then we found out what had happened to him. One of the very sad things about male sexual abuse is that it very often is much more painful than what happens to little girls. So what happens to little boys, it's hard to listen to the stories, but what happens to little boys can often be very physically painful and intrusive and scary, which is why, think about what boys do. When boys are victimized, what do we train our boys to do? Do we train our boys to be victims?
No.
No, we do not. We train our boys to get on top of things, and to become alpha males and to fight back. One of the expressions I used to use with the childcare staff a lot was that when kids are molested, girls get pregnant and boys steal cars, because girls turn their victimization in on themselves and say, I must have deserved it. It was the way I dressed. It was what I did. I let that happen. This is my fault. And boys say, well, I'm going to get them before they get me. So what you often are going to find with kids who do any kind of acting out like this is that something happened to them and they're saying, okay, I'm getting on top of this. Nobody's ever touching me again. And then what is our reaction as childcare staff? We turn against them and we say, well, you know, they're bad kids. They shouldn't be doing that. This kid shouldn't be putting sticks up somebody's backside. He's a bad kid. We don't want to do that. We want to be able to say what happened to you so that we can help you with what happened to you. This is the only one of these examples that's somewhat ambiguous. Your 9-year-old foster daughter has entered puberty early, and the school reports she's been going into the bathroom and showing the other same age girls her breasts. The other girl says that your foster daughter tells them $1 to look or $2 to touch.
I think she's an entrepreneur.
You know, that is actually the exact right answer.
I mean,
I've never had anybody get it quite that quickly, but yeah, I mean, of course, this could be something, couldn't it? Of course, she could be.
She's been watching too much Cardi B. That's what it is. She's seen too many Cardi B videos.
And that's exactly right. This is one of those things where you kind of look at it and go, okay, what's happening here? What exactly is happening here? Now, if you took this scenario just a little bit farther and she was then exposing herself or exposing her genitalia or inviting people to touch her genitalia, if this example progressed, you might say, oh, I don't know about this. But it's also one of those ones where you kind of look at it and go, I don't know, let me think about this for a minute. And it is also one of those things where kids in foster care have often been exposed to behavior that you might not in your own family of origin. So I can tell you, walking into a public ladies' room one day, they weren't English speaking, so I don't know what culture they were. It was a grandmother and a mother and a girl who was maybe 9 years old. And they were all touching her breasts because she was beginning to develop. And for them, culturally, they were just looking at her saying, oh, look at her breasts are beginning to develop, but they just didn't seem to know they shouldn't be doing it in a public bathroom. So sometimes this stuff is kind of cultural. Sometimes it's a little weird. When you look at this thing with the sticks and you know that shouldn't be happening. But sometimes you're going to listen to some of the stories that you have in your kids in the cottages and say, let's try to see if this is abnormal child rearing. Let's try to see if it's just the beginning of abnormal exposure, or is it something that we just want to say, look, honey, you don't do things like that. It's redirection is a lot of this, and not overreacting like you're a lunatic is also.
We were just discussing that we have a young lady who we're just glad we haven't seen this behavior from her yet, but we would not be shocked at all if we did see this behavior.
Yeah, and you might. One of the difficulties that we always have had on the Enterprise campus, and you mentioned the human trafficking, is kids coming in who have been trafficked that haven't been publicly acknowledged as having been trafficked, who then act out or come on, mostly to the male child care staff, because they don't know any better. They don't know they shouldn't be doing that. And certainly we've had that happen multiple times. We've had it happen in our adoption families where kids are kids are adopted, and the adoptive parents have no idea that this has happened. And the next thing you know, the poor adoptive father's reading the kid a story, and the kid starts humping his leg, and the poor adoptive father doesn't know what to do. So sometimes we really, a lot of it, and a lot of your job is re-education. You just say, no, you don't do this. And I think this is our last one. You enter the bedroom and find two young foster daughters, ages 3 and 4. They yell at you to leave, and they say they're doing some private things, and they tell you that they are playing doctor's office, and they're giving each other pretend shots, and they're prescribing M&M candy pills. Would you be concerned about that?
I can't say that because I worked in daycare and they said that was normal.
I know.
Yeah, like I was taught that was normal.
I would keep a closer eye. I mean, maybe it is
Yeah,
normal,
keep an
but
eye
I would
on
keep
it.
an eye just to make
I would
sure.
tell them, you know, make sure you keep the door open. We don't close the door if you're playing
Right.
doctor or whatever.
Right.
But,
Right.
you know.
And maybe we keep our clothes on because we don't take our clothes off
But
at the
at
doctor's office.
At the doctor's office, they make them take their
They
clothes
do
off
make
and
them
put on
take
a little
their clothes
robe.
Oh, yeah, but they put on a little robe.
But that's the only thing they miss.
They might have
Yeah,
put
little robe.
on the road. That's what it
So we're not sure. We think it's probably normal, but we're a little concerned nevertheless.
Okay, you guys are really good. If you go back to that thing about normal and abnormal development, the chart that I gave, usually in this age range, these kids are preschoolers. They're like 3 and 4. They're used to people touching their bodies. They're used to they're usually by 3 and 4, they're used to people helping them get dressed. They might be used to people helping them toilet. So in that age range, you haven't quite started to say to kids, okay, your body is yourself. And playing doctor, if we want to call it that, is pretty common at that stage. But I heard somebody say it. You're absolutely right. This is what you keep an eye on, especially if you have kids in a group home setting. This is what you keep an eye on to make sure that it doesn't begin to progress. And what might, if you're the child care staff worker that walked in on this, what might you say to them in terms of re-education? I heard somebody say it before. Maybe you need to keep your clothes on.
Right.
Yeah.
Keep the door open.
My creative
Somebody said-
genius would kick in and I would find a shirt or something and cut it up for them to make
Make a little robe, yeah. I think the sentence in the story that was like the one that makes you wonder if it's okay is when you walk in and they yelled, "We're doing private things." That's the one that makes us, that's the one that made me go, ooh, I don't know if this is okay or not. Because like normally when I see kids playing doctor, they're playing in the common spaces or the living room, or they ask you to be the patient and they give you shots and they're listening to their little toy stethoscope. And that's what I think of when I think playing doctor. I don't think of doing it in a closed room or a bedroom or things like that. I mean, unless you're a teenager and you're playing doctor, and that's a very different thing.
Right. Yeah, your point is very well taken, because these are kids who private, what does private mean? Private for a lot of our kids means something they're keeping a secret. And they're told when they are groomed that this is private, that this is a secret, that this is just between us, and you're not going to tell anybody because people will blame you. So you kind of pick that apart very well. For the most part, it's playing doctor.
And I was going to say, that's where I ask my staff, and what do we tell kids secrets are?
Right.
Dangerous.
Right. Exactly. Well, and you know, you are childcare staff, so you are looking at this from the lens of people who have been exposed to this over and over again. When I did this for foster parents. Foster parents are not. Foster parents do not have the level of exposure and training that you guys get. And they have a lot of kids coming and going in their homes. And depending on what their level of training and education is, they can either really, really help or they can really, really hurt. So, which is why we ended up doing this training to begin with. So I'm going to show you something in a few minutes. When we say kids they're all going to have some kind of sexual behaviors, but it's within a normal development. So what we want to train our child care staff and our foster parents to do is try to help kids understand that healthy sense of what a sexual self is. Most of these kids have really been trained in the very unhealthy way of having sex. And they've seen it be harmful. They've seen it be hurtful. They've more than likely seen it be scary. You know, you get to read their stories. We do comprehensive behavioral health assessments here, and the stories of these kids are scary. I don't know how a lot of these kids have survived even to get to as far as you when we read what has happened to them before they get to you. So that's what they're thinking of. That's what they think sex is. They think it's harmful, hurtful, scary, violent, and they don't know any better. So what are we going to learn about this? We certainly know that these kids have missed that development of a healthy sexual self. And we also know that their history is going to reflect their behavior. They're going to do what they've been exposed to do. And the more severe it is, the worse it's going to be. You can really, and it sounds like you're already redirecting a lot of these behaviors. It sounds like you're already very aware of the fact that kids who've been exposed are going to do things to other kids. And it doesn't make them bad. It really doesn't. And we always start with what happened to this kid. And I can tell you that is not, we didn't do that 20 years ago. When you want to talk about the way we have evolved, we did not do this 20 years ago. We said, oh, this is a bad kid. And I can tell you, we went from every kid is a victim to every kid is reactive to every kid is a sex offender. And then we kind of backed away from all of that and said, no, kids are not sex offenders. But it wasn't that long ago that we were naming kids in files as sex offenders. And once you do that, that's like a computer virus that spreads through their file. You never get rid of it. And I have seen a lot of foster parents call kids sex offenders. They're not sex offenders. They are kids who've been offended on sexually. All right, I'm going to show you guys a little video and then we're going to try to wrap up here. Wait a minute, hold on.
I used to do a lot of bad things. I liked to break stuff. I thought I was different because I felt angry all the time. Sometimes I wondered if something was wrong inside me. I felt sad all the time and nobody else seemed to. Sometimes I felt so different from Lily and my friends. I just wanted to cry.
Abuse causes a lot of emotions that can affect kids in different ways.
It can make you feel anger, or like fighting and yelling. It can make you sad or isolated, and even make you have dark thoughts. Abuse is like a thorn in your hand that hurts until you take it out. The pain can change how you see the world. It made Mateo angry and get in trouble in school. It made Amber feel like she was all alone and would never be happy again. Both felt something hurting inside and thought no one would understand why.
I didn't remember what it was like to wake up without a nightmare. I'd feel sad most of the day after, and like I was in a fog. Mom would ask how I was, but I couldn't think of anything that would make her happy. The only thing I could think about was the only thing I didn't want to think about. when my stepdad would take me to the spare room and sexually abuse me.
The principal said he was tired of seeing me in his office. I saw him last week for yelling in class, and because I tricked a girl, and because I got in a fight after school. The principal asked me why I was so angry, and I said I didn't know why. He asked why I threw a rock at the car that day, and I couldn't talk. I didn't think he'd get it, that the car looked just like the coach's car, and it reminded me of driving back from our soccer games and the assistant coach touching me in the back seat. And it made me feel angry and like I wanted to hurt people. He said he thought something was bothering me. I told him he didn't want to know about it, but he said he did want to know. He said whatever it was, he might be able to help, and I believed him. So I told him about the abuse.
Billy noticed my arm. She asked if I hurt myself. I told her I feel bad about myself sometimes, like something was broken inside me and I'm different from everyone else. She said we weren't different, but she didn't understand what was wrong. So I told her I had a secret that hurt me to keep. And for some reason, I started to tell her about the abuse.
After I told, I didn't feel so angry anymore. I felt like myself again.
I felt like I didn't have to keep my sadness all to myself. After telling about the abuse, I didn't feel so alone. I could talk to my friends and feel happy. I didn't feel like something was wrong inside me anymore.
Abuse is a terrible secret to keep. It made Amber's entire world seem dark and sad, and her behavior became dark and sad too.
Abuse made Mateo feel angry. He hurt people and broke things without knowing why.
All those confusing emotions made them feel like something was wrong inside, but it was the abuse that made them feel that way.
Keeping a secret about abuse hurts, and our behavior shows how we feel inside. Talking about abuse can help take the pain away and help us feel better, just like Amber and Mateo.
Okay, if you guys are interested, the Circle of Friends Services has a YouTube channel, and we have a lot of playlists on the YouTube channel. This is from the playlist for sexual abuse, and we have a lot of these little videos. We have a lot of different books that we put into playlists and different interventions. We have a human trafficking playlist, and it's certainly it's free and open to the public. So if any of you want to use it as resources, you're more than welcome to do so. The reason I pulled this little one out is just, these are two kids who blamed themselves for what happened. But what is it that basically saved these two kids and got them on the road to healing? They each had what?
Support.
Yeah. They each had somebody that they could talk to. And the reason actually I use this little one is because over the years, I cannot tell you how many disclosures I have gotten from kids at the oddest times when I'm not expecting it. And it's almost like you have to put that resting face on and make sure that you don't go, because your first reaction is essential with these kids. Mateo was angry. You know, I said girls get pregnant and boys steal cars. He was angry. He was angry because he was hurt. And Amber was scared because she blamed herself. So this is a cartoon, but this is very, very common behavior. And it's very common for kids to finally tell. And if the first person you tell is receptive and helpful, you will go on and tell again. If the first person you tell reacts badly, it can set your recovery back by years. And And I certainly can say that because I have had adult clients who have told me that the very first person they told didn't believe them, and then they didn't ever bring it up again for years. So what happens to those kids? Now they're in their 20s, and they've tried to tell their story. They've tried to tell somebody, and it didn't get a good reception, so they back away. But your reaction is really pretty critical to these kids. And I'm gonna just hold on a second. I just want to show you one more thing. Stop sharing screen. And I'll probably show this to Alexa because this is a book that Micah turned me on to. It's called Sexualized Children, Assessment and Treatment of Sexualized Children and Children Who Molest. It's a fabulous book. It was printed a long time ago. It's Eliana Gill and Tony Kavanaugh Johnson. It was printed in 1991. But Micah has this book, and for any of you, there are all kinds of assessments and questions you can ask kids in the back, little assessment tools that you can use as part of what you're doing. We use it. It's a really, really good book. And the reason I like it is because we did go through an era where we blamed all these kids for everything. We sadly did. We called them all sex offenders. We went through that whole period. And we also always need to remember that they are not sex offenders. They are just kids who've had something happen to them. So your reaction is pretty critical when they tell you something, and it really does start kids on their road to healing. So anybody want to make any comment before we'll probably wrap up? This one usually is a little bit shorter than the other three. Has this been okay for you guys? Because you've been really pretty marvelous.
I think it's a lot to take in, and we will chat about it amongst ourselves probably a little bit after we get off, just so I can take everybody's temperature to see how they're feeling. Because some of this is hard stuff to hear. Like, we work in it and we know it, but it still doesn't make anybody's heart feel better knowing that this is what our kids are facing. So we'll chat about it a little bit. And if anybody has any questions, Barbara, is it okay if I email them to you or we pose them for the next time?
You can just email them to me. That's absolutely fine. And you know, Neva's point is really well taken. This is not easy stuff. And even though you do it day after day after day, it's some of what happens to our kids. Even when I'm reading the CBHAs, it's so overwhelming. The things that they go through are astonishing. And yet they are living to tell the tale. They are trying to get up and go to school and do their stuff every day. And we're there to help them, but don't be afraid to say it's hard, because it really is hard. It's hard stuff. I mean, you know, there's a lot of professions that you could have that might be worse. You could be a roofer, but I don't know that anything could be worse sometimes than what you guys are doing. So absolutely, any questions? If you have any right now, we can certainly look at them. But I think you are right to take the temperature of the room. I usually kind of simmer down myself when these trainings are over. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
All right, you guys have a good one.
Yes, ma'am. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.